my presentation today is to answer this question: is mindfulness really Buddhistic? In the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to attempt to answer this question from many directions, and that's what I'm going to do right now. So now the first thing that I would like to share, a kind of a preamble to what I'm going to unfold in the next few minutes, is that we need to recognize that today in the popular world, there are two streams of mindfulness. Now, the first one is certainly the Buddhist school or the stream of mindfulness, which is religious, which deals with soteriological goals. And the second stream of mindfulness, which has become very popular in the recent decades, is the modern or secular mindfulness. So I will be using these two terms interchangeably. They refer to the same thing. When I say secular mindfulness, or when I use the term modern mindfulness, they refer to the same thing. So now I'm going to identify my sources in terms of how did I gather the information that I'm going to present in the next few minutes. Now, I have primarily used a very interesting source, at least in my opinion, because I've confined myself to the works of the inventor or the founder or the innovator of modern mindfulness or secular mindfulness, Dr. John Kabat-Zinn, as well as other secondary sources. And interestingly, almost all of what I'm going to share is going to come from the Western scholarly world, and there's a reason for that. One of the reasons that I'm doing this is because this is an opportunity for us to uncover a tension that is already taking place in the world of modern or secular mindfulness. And that's precisely the reason. As much as I am very familiar and also very, very committed to the Indic traditions, but today my focus is primarily to talk about mindfulness and revealing this tension and what we are seeing in the Western scholarly world as well as in the world of practice. So let's look at the trajectory of modern mindfulness first. And this is my conclusion. I'm going to start with the end in mind. I'm going to begin with the very clear end in mind. This is what I'm trying to show to you in terms of what's happening in the modern mindfulness world. So we know that whenever the word mindfulness comes, since the more than 100 years ago, with the term mindfulness is used to a specific type of meditation practice in Buddhism. All right, and therefore, since then, people have always associated mindfulness as a Buddhist practice. However, now there happens a departure from Buddhism, and this is something that people don't see, or some Buddhist scholars are already seeing this. And this departure is what we call as modern mindfulness. So you can see there's a clear line dividing these two spaces from the left and right. So modern mindfulness is certainly a departure from Buddhism. We need to recognize that. However, people do not recognize also that modern mindfulness has not been influenced as much as by the early Buddhism. When I use the word early Buddhism, I'm talking about in the first 1,000 or 1,500 years after the Buddha. We don't see that much of an influence. Instead, we see a huge influence of American Buddhism, which is also one form of Western Buddhism on modern mindfulness, which we'll examine shortly. The other less acknowledged influence on modern mindfulness, which I've already spoken about a couple of times in Indica forums, which is the influence of Advaita Vedanta, which is very much not acknowledged in the scholarly world, and as well as Hatha Yoga. So these three streams have also influenced tremendously on modern mindfulness. So this is what we know as modern mindfulness. And then in the last 10 years, or maybe slightly lesser than that, we see another thing that's happening, another phenomenon, which is a return. Now, there is also a very strong lobby that is actually becoming more and more vocal about a reclamation of modern mindfulness and trying to get it back into Buddhism. And this is basically the trajectory of modern mindfulness today. And what I'm going to share in the next few minutes is to uncover this. So here is a very good, what I call presentation by Jeff Wilson. He says that modern mindfulness has gone through 6 stages, as you can see. Mediating mindfulness and mystifying mindfulness is the first phase. And then the next, rather you can cluster these 2 phases as one. And then you can see the medicalizing phase of mindfulness, mainstreaming mindfulness, and marketing mindfulness. These 3 can be clustered together. And currently we see a very strong wave, which is moralizing mindfulness, which comes again from the return. I call the return trajectory of modern mindfulness, which is where people are trying to reclaim mindfulness back into the Buddhist tradition. So let's look at this right now. So let's define modern mindfulness so that we have a little more less haziness around it in terms of what it is. So we know that usually mindfulness teachers and practitioners accept John Kabat-Zinn's definition as the textbook definition. All practitioners and teachers or even researchers go back to John Kabat-Zinn because he's the founder. So you can see here, this is the very famous definition for mindfulness. There are a couple more, but this is one of the famous ones as well, which is the awareness that arises through paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally, in the service of self-understanding and wisdom. Now, this is quite a later definition that Kabat-Zinn has given. In his earlier definitions, he would not include two important terms in here, which is self-understanding and wisdom. It would just be awareness, attention, present moment, and non-judgmentally, and of course on purpose. Self-understanding and wisdom are some words that have emerged recently. Now, the next thing that we're going to look at is how did it all start? So this whole modern mindfulness movement started with the mindfulness-based stress reduction in the late 1970s. And then it moved into another kind of a MBP, or we call mindfulness-based program, which is mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, or called MBCT, from the Oxford University, and eventually Oxford started the Oxford Mindfulness Center as well. So these together can be called as the first generation MBPs. By the acronym MBP, it means mindfulness-based programs. Now, from here, you see then a wide variety of different type of MBPs emerged right after the MBCT. So in the last 15 years or so, you see what I call a huge or a large number of new mindfulness programs coming up. And in fact, I've been part of some of these as well. And these are perhaps this can be perhaps called the second generation MBPs. So we have the first generation MBPs and then the second generation MBPs. Now, we also need to recognize that all the second generation MBPs actually are built on the premise of the first generation MBPs. And even the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy program, or MBP, also is built on the premise of MBSR. So the MBSR is the first of the modern mindfulness program. Now, here's a very interesting quote from John Kabat-Zinn, where he says, MBSR is based on rigorous and systematic training in mindfulness, a form of meditation originally developed in the Buddhist traditions of Asia. Yep, he's absolutely right in saying this, but there is more, and he has also acknowledged that, and we will look at that right now. So let's now first look at the departure. When I use the word departure, this is the term that I've used in the drawing that I shared earlier. And we're going to look at what caused it, which is basically this. So we want to see, how did modern mindfulness depart from Buddhism? That's the first thing that we need to look at. So here you can see the one biggest influence is American Buddhism. We need to acknowledge that. And American Buddhism has itself evolved over the last century or so. As you can see here, the first wave of American Buddhist scholars or teachers were usually called the Transcendentalists. Many of you may know who they are. And after that, a little later in the 1940s, 50s, Zen became popular. So this is the first wave of American Buddhism. And then you see a second wave. And this is what we call as explicitly American Buddhism. Now, many teachers are part of this, like, for example, Jack Cornfield, Joseph Goldstein. And in fact, Kabat-Zinn is also probably coming at the tail end of this second wave, where you see a big movement that arises from this second wave in America, which is the Vipassana movement, which many of us may attribute it to the work of Goenka. Now, from this Vipassana as well, in the parallel, we see the modern mindfulness movement. In fact, the modern mindfulness movement is built also from Vipassana as well. There's a huge influence of that as well. So you can certainly see that both Vipassana and modern mindfulness come from the American Buddhist tradition, especially in the US. And some of you may know that Vipassana is sometimes considered by Buddhist scholars as an invented tradition. It is not an authentic Buddhist tradition in that sense, but an invented tradition. We're going to look at that shortly as well. Now, this whole evolution from the first wave all the way till right now. Now, what we see, Jamie Kuchinskas has done a very good job here by sharing that what's happening is a watered down version of Buddhism. Now, it's a very, very strong word. It's a watered down version of Buddhism. Why? Because there is a very explicit and concerted effort to make it scientific and also presenting it as a tolerant religion, which something Dr. Joydeep Begji was also talking about earlier. And as well as you see a rise of non-monastic teachers. Now, if you look at Buddhism, traditionally has always been monastic teachers, but here you see non-monastic teachers. And then they also promoted a spiritual materialism. That means you can be spiritual at the same time you can be materialistic. And lastly, they redefined suffering. Now, if you look at early Buddhism, Buddha's definition of suffering, which is sarvam dukkha, that dukkha is an existential suffering. But here in American Buddhism, suffering has been redefined as the conventional terms of illnesses or stress and all of that. So practical problems became also suffering in this particular American Buddhism. So here is actually a lineage of modern mindfulness teachers. Now, people ask, where did modern mindfulness come from? Here, I've built a kind of a tree to show where it comes from. Now, what I would like you to notice is that all right on the top, you see a very important person, Ledai Sayadaw, is actually a Burmese Buddhist monk. Now, that's where it begins. Now, this is very important in locating mindfulness because we need to know that mindfulness, the modern mindfulness movement actually starts with Burmese Buddhism, which is a response to colonial Burma. So this is something that I think many of you may be interested to do more research on. But what I would like you to notice is right at the bottom, you see Jon Kabat-Zinn. And Jon Kabat-Zinn teachers or influencers were three important people here, Hoover, Goldstein, and Cornfield. And interestingly, Cornfield and Goldstein have also learned Advaita Vedanta. So you can certainly see where Kabat-Zinn's Advaita Vedanta or yoga influences come from. It comes from his teachers. And it looks like it was perhaps unconscious because the American Buddhism was very different from perhaps the ancient or traditional Buddhism in that sense. Now, the next thing that we're going to see now is this particular box that I've created. Now, this is the beginning of what we call as the Western mindfulness or American mindfulness movement. This is where it starts. Right above that, it's still in Burma, right? Once it comes down here, you see the Western interpretation coming out. And there is a lot of work around it as well, which I'm going to share very briefly shortly. Now, what are the non-Buddhist philosophical influences of modern mindfulness? Kabat-Zinn acknowledges these influences. He says it's Sufism, Taoism, yoga, and Advaita Vedanta. He mentions that. You can find the reference as well. And the secularity of mindfulness is very easily defined. Now, you take all of these components, obviously, Buddhism, Zen, yoga, Advaita Vedanta are all spiritual traditions. However, what was systematically secular about modern mindfulness is the cultural and the faith dimensions are taken away, are subtracted. And then an empirical dimension is introduced, which means that research, the whole idea of research, and that becomes modern mindfulness or the secularity of modern mindfulness. Now, the outcomes of mindfulness in Buddhist mindfulness is quite different from modern or secular mindfulness. You can see here the difference. In Buddhist mindfulness, mindfulness is actually part of a process to attain nirvana. But in the modern mindfulness, if you look at it, it's for stress reduction, emotional regulation, self-awareness enhancement, and happiness and well-being. One can certainly say that the goals are different. Now, here you can see Kabat-Zinn's quote, where he expresses his intention behind secularizing mindfulness. He says that an American vocabulary would probably be better for Americans. And then the secularization would probably allow people to relieve stress or suffering without having to subscribe to these religious ideals. I mean, being a medical doctor is quite understandable why he felt the way he did. Now, at the same time, there are also recently scholars who also identify interesting things in Kabat-Zinn's influence. Here you can see Sarah Shaw, very great Buddhist scholar as well. She says that Kabat-Zinn has been deeply influenced, I want to emphasize, deeply influenced by his contact with Burmese Vipassana teachers and both Advaita Vedanta and Zen traditions. This is a very important point. So here you can see the non-Buddhist roots of modern mindfulness have also been acknowledged by Kabat-Zinn. In fact, Kabat-Zinn mentions, in this case, you'll be interested to see the bright at the bottom. He talks about Hatha Yoga or postural yoga, and he also mentions Nisargadatta Maharaj and Ramana Maharishi. In fact, the first, if I'm not wrong, the first version of the MBSR workbook, in there you can find a very nice quote printed by Nisargadatta Maharaj, who is a very famous Advaita Vedanta teacher. So you can see this in this particular presentation. Now let's talk about the return. Now we looked at the departure. Now we're going to look at the return. So this is the departure, how it departed. You can see the influences, the roots, how Kabat-Zinn got the ideas and how it went there. Now let's look at the return. Why is it returning now? So this criticism is coming from usually the Buddhist lobbies, especially the Western Buddhist lobbies. Quite interesting as it may sound. You can see here two authors here making this point. They say that can meditation that was developed within Buddhism, which teaches that desire lies at the core of suffering, be transformed into a convenient means to achieving a desired end without losing some of its heart? Here's another one. The Western need to justify a practice by measuring and quantifying assumes utilitarianism as the highest good. And very importantly, it means that basically you need to justify yourself with some use. That's the argument. Simply being yourself is not enough. So you can see these criticisms coming up. So we need to now locate where mindfulness is in the Buddhist tradition. As you can see here, in the Eightfold Path of the Buddha, you can see right mindfulness, right at the bottom, Samma Sati in Pali, it comes there. So you can see it's a process. So in Buddhism, mindfulness is certainly a process that leads you to enlightenment or nirvana. So it is part of a framework. So what has happened right now is that, of course, that mindfulness has been extracted from this process and now used, and evidence is suggesting great salutary effects, which we cannot deny. So here, let's look at what was mindfulness for in Buddhism. Here you can see 8 important, what I call purposes for mindfulness. But I've highlighted point 8 because that's what I'm talking about, because mindfulness was part of a process for attaining enlightenment. That was the real reason why it is there. Everything else is in service of that goal. So again, another modern criticism by David Forbes. Here he says that a lot of corporations are adopting mindfulness as part of their corporate culture. Mindfulness without any moral roots can be used as a hack for all kinds of unsavory ends. Interesting. Now, here's another one. There is a misrepresentation of the place and value of meditation in the Buddhist tradition, including its depiction as a purely rational method of self-exploration, which would feel alien to countless past generations of Buddhists. You can see that. Again, people uncovering this tension. Now, let me summarize, right? I know that time is, at this point, a very important dimension to consider when I'm presenting. So here's a quick summary. Now, the return trajectory of modern mindfulness implies there are 3 important things that we need to note. Number 1, the reclaiming mindfulness and reintegrating it into Buddhism, which I'm going to talk about more, even if it is even possible. Now, number 2, the ethics neutrality of modern mindfulness is unwholesome, is one of the issue. The third issue, that there is an absence of a social dimension in modern mindfulness, and that is unwholesome. These are basically the arguments of people who are trying to bring modern mindfulness back into Buddhism. Or even people who are not Buddhists, but this is basically the intention. Now let's discuss from what I've just presented. Now, from what I've presented, I see 3 problems. Now, the first problem is something called the bare attention tradition. Now, the bare attention tradition starts as a very unique kind of a departure within Buddhism. And it starts in Burma. And it starts with this particular group, this particular tree of teachers. Now, the Vipassana also belongs to this particular bare attention tradition. Now, the bare attention tradition has been very, very much criticized by traditional Buddhist scholars and practitioners as well. So here you can see. Now, the bare attention tradition is designed to be accessible to laypersons. It did not require familiarity with Buddhist philosophy or literature, most notably with the scholastic literature known as Abhidharma or Abhidhamma. Now, the other issue that I've listed here, you can read that a little later, probably when the video comes up. But the important point I want to point out is that right at point 5, neglecting the importance of ethical judgment, which comes up in the bare attention tradition. This problem 1, which I just shared, which is the bare attention tradition, which is devoid of ethics. That means there's no values that are connected to mindfulness or the practice of mindfulness in this bare attention tradition that created or contributed to modern mindfulness. Problem 2, the absence of pessimism, very interesting as it may sound. Now, Robert Sharp is very astute here. He makes a very interesting observation. He says that early Buddhism basically took the view that to live is to suffer. The very living is suffering. And the only genuine remedy to suffering is escape from samsara altogether. That means if you are stressed right now, the way out is not to go and meditate. The way out is to renounce, which is a very important component, which is in Sanskrit, which is called vairagya. Now, this vairagya is a very important component in Buddhism. The only way out is you need to become a monk or a nun, which is called bhikkhu, right, or bhikkhuni as they are called. So here you can see escape requires, among other things, abandoning hope that happiness in this world is possible. So here you can see a very interesting position of Buddhism, early Buddhism, which is happiness is not the goal. Nirvana is not even for happiness. In fact, happiness is itself the cause of suffering. Seeking happiness is also a cause of suffering. So therefore, modern mindfulness has taken a different trajectory, as you can see. Now, here you can see, again, his criticism towards mindfulness as well. He says, yet today, Buddhist insight is touted as the very antithesis of depression. Can you believe that? Right? Rather than cultivating a desire to abandon the world, Buddhism is seen as a science of happiness. Now, a very, very interesting perspective. And in my opinion, this is a very, very important perspective that is required in the appreciation of early Buddhism. Now, problem number 3, wrong attributions to its sources. Modern mindfulness sources has been wrongly attributed. Now, here you can see Robert Sharp again. He says that the traditional Buddhist perspective is there has to be an active engagement with Buddhist doctrine and Buddhist forms of life. However, in my modern mindfulness, it is not there. It is secular. And here is a very interesting book, which says, very famous book, to be very honest, a great book. I use this for teaching mindfulness teachers in this part of the world as well. A great book. However, there are some inaccuracies. Now here it says, ancient wisdom meets modern psychology. I beg to differ, because the mindfulness movement is not inspired by ancient wisdom. It is something that happened recently in the last 100 years or slightly longer. So one of the things that we see is the less acknowledged sources of influence for modern mindfulness, modern Hatha Yoga, Advaita Vedanta, Sufism, Taoism, all of them are unacknowledged in research papers or books that are published. Every book, almost every 99% of the books on mindfulness take the position that mindfulness is Buddhistic or from Buddhist roots. They do not look, they do not examine or even study these less acknowledged sources. So modern mindfulness is more eclectic than it is painted out to be. And truly, it is not ancient. We need to come to terms with this fact that mindfulness is not ancient, or at least modern mindfulness is not ancient. Now, what are the takeaways? All right, I'm going to now summarize what I wanted to present today. Now, I've made my conclusion in the form of questions. First question: is modern mindfulness ancient? Obviously, it is not. All right. Number 2, did Buddhism solely influence it? No. Buddhism is not the sole influence of modern mindfulness. Question 3, did Western or American Buddhism influence it? Obviously, the answer is yes, it's one of the influences. And did the bare attention tradition via American Buddhism allow the inclusion of other non-Buddhistic philosophies to influence modern Buddhism? And the answer is yes, because the early teachers of American Buddhism, or at least in the 70s, they were very eclectic. They actually took yoga philosophies. They went and they spent time with Advaita Vedanta teachers, and they got all of this because they derived value and they brought that into the teachings. And these teachings eventually reached out to Jon Kabat-Zinn, as we know. And therefore, MBSR is actually influenced by more than one tradition, or the early mindfulness movement. So the question now is modern mindfulness really Buddhistic? That's the topic of my presentation today. So I'm going to answer this question by another question, which is, do we have a precedence where a religious practice has been appropriated or secularized? All right. Now, there is. Take a look at this. These are paintings or depictions of very early Hatha Yoga asanas. These are all the Natha yogis. As you know, some of you may be very familiar with the Natha tradition that actually contributed to Hatha Yoga. Now, this is actually a spiritual practice. It has own limbs. There are many limbs in Hatha Yoga. It's a spiritual practice aimed towards mukti or moksha, liberation. However, what do we see today? Right? We have the secularization of Hatha Yoga. You can see that today, Hatha Yoga too has been secularized because the goals of Hatha Yoga in the modern world today, or 99% of the studios in the world, basically the goals are the one that you see on the right, which is to make you happier, improve sleep, weight reduction, name it, right? It has become so proliferated in that sense. However, there is one thing that I would like to differentiate from this secularization of Hatha Yoga compared to modern mindfulness, which is this. Now, asana practice and the practice of asana or Hatha Yoga for therapeutic benefits have already been found in the Hatha Yoga Shastras. That's the interesting bit. That when you look at the Hatha Yoga Shastras, Hatha Yoga Pradipika, or you look at the Hatha Ratnavali, all of them talk about therapeutic features. They are also interested in therapy. So the Hatha Yoga, what I call the extension and the way that it has grown, is on the bedrock of a what I call a belief or a practice that is already within Hatha Yoga. So what you see in the what I call in the yoga studios is an extension in that sense. So it's still part of the Hatha Yoga tradition in that sense, although people are just focusing on asanas. However, mindfulness was not such a practice. In the Buddhist tradition, mindfulness was never used for depression. Mindfulness was never used for stress reduction. It was used only for the purpose of nirvana in that sense, or enlightenment. Here you can see a very big, what I call difference compared to Hatha Yoga and mindfulness. So the question is here. I'm going to now answer this question. This is going to be my last 2 slides. Is modern mindfulness really Buddhistic? So I'm going to answer this question with this image. Now, why am I choosing this image? Because the illustration of a chariot comes from a 7th to 8th century Buddhist dialectician called Chandrakirti. Now, Chandrakirti, in his Madhyamaka Avatara, he presents the illustration of a chariot to justify selflessness or anatmavada or anatta. He uses this to justify dependent origination, which is a very important theory of Buddhism. Now, using that illustration, we can now understand mindfulness. You know why? Mindfulness is also like a chariot. You know why? Because a chariot is made up of wheels, the shaft, the axle, the spokes, the hub. Together, when they're put together, they become a chariot. If you take every one of them away, it ceases to be a chariot. Similarly, modern mindfulness, as you see here, like a chariot, is actually a combination of different traditions, different systems. So the wheel cannot, if the wheel is to be considered Buddhism, you cannot say the wheel is equal to the chariot. If the shaft is equal to yoga, we cannot say that the shaft is equal to the chariot. All of them have come together as if they were constructed, ontologically, right, to create mindfulness. So therefore, we cannot say that mindfulness belongs to any one of these. So the whole attempt to even reclaim mindfulness as it is today, as it is practiced today, and bring it back to the Buddhist fold, to me, is like saying that the wheel of the chariot is the chariot itself. I believe this illustration would have answered the question that I'm here to respond in this presentation. With that, thank you, my friends, for listening to this presentation.
Thank you so much, Kathir.